Today we are checking out this new focal reducer from Viltrox. This is for adapting EF lenses to RF mount cameras, such as the Red Komodo here, or maybe the Canon C70, and in some circles, people refer to these as speed boosters. Fun fact, Metabones actually own the rights to the phrase speed booster because they are the OGs when it comes to smart lens adapters. Anyways, that term speed booster comes from the fact that not only will these little guys give you a wider field of view, but also an extra stop of light. So for instance, in this example here, when I take this lens that I like to refer to as the workhorse lens, which is the Sigma Art 18-35 f1.8, and I throw it onto the Viltrox focal reducer, and I slam the focal length to 35 millimeters, and I throw it onto the Red Komodo, what the Viltrox does is it changes the original crop factor of the Komodo, which is 1.36, down to 0.96. So now when the Sigma Art is set to 35 millimeters at that wide open aperture of 1.8, the Viltrox combination makes it perform more like a 34 millimeter set to f1.2. And without the Viltrox focal reducer, the Sigma Art on its own with a dummy EF to RF adapter, it performs more like a 48mm f1.8 lens. Now obviously all of this is in comparison to something like the field of view of an Arri Alexa Mini LF at open gate. So obviously you have to keep everything in perspective. The internet just loves debating and arguing and going nuts over the real reality of what these focal reducers and speed boosters are doing, and every single anal camera person wants to prove how smart they are. Meanwhile, I could care less. The reality is, does it give you a wider field of view? Yes. Does it increase your maximum aperture? Yes. Moving on. The real question here is how well does this specific Viltrox focal reducer work, and would I recommend using this adapter in a real-world working set? So there are two key ingredients that I look for when shopping for lens adapters. The first one is, does it have a support foot? And the Viltrox does. The reason why the support foot is so important is because that allows you to bolt the adapter directly to your camera cage, thus making your camera and the adapter one solid unit. Side note here, when it comes to using this specific Viltrox focal reducer with the Red Komodo, you will have to remove the adapter foot before slapping it on the camera, and that's because the Komodo has this weird little ridge on the camera body, right? Down here it's got a little lip, so you just have to take the foot off, then put the adapter onto the Komodo, and then go ahead and slap the foot on. It's just one little extra step. But there is another piece to the puzzle, and this is where our Viltrox focal reducer falls short. It does not have a locking mount between the lens and the adapter itself. So let's compare to this Metabones CineLock speed booster. Now this is what I always used on my Pocket 4K, and I still own it because I still own my GH5. So it does have a tie-down foot and what they call a Cine locking mount. In other words, it converts the EF mount to a positive lock mount. And this is a very important feature for professional working situations, in my opinion. Now, this is the adapter that has lived on my Red Komodo pretty much since day one, the Kippertie Adapta-Mount for EF to RF. Now, this is not a focal reducer, but it certainly is an industry standard locking mount. It has a really nice tie-down foot that not only offers your standard 1/4-20, but also a much sturdier 3/8-16. And the best part is a really strong positive lock. Just sounds good. Now, much like our Viltrox, the Kippertie does also have electronic connectors for all of our friends that like to use lenses with autofocus and electronic communication. Now, unlike both the Metabones and the Viltrox, the Kippertie has zero plastic. This bad boy is all stainless steel and aerospace grade aluminum. When it comes to reliability and sturdiness, this, folks, is the king of the hill. But again, it's not a focal reducer. However, you must see what happens when there is no positive lock between the lens and the adapter. In this side-by-side right here, you'll see how much wiggle the Viltrox introduces. Now, the real deal breaker for me is when using a follow focus motor. What you are watching right now is what will happen when you are using a follow focus motor on your lens when it's connected via the Viltrox. Now, if you need this pointed out for you, just pay attention to the tops and bottom of the frame. There is some pretty heinous vertical image shift happening there. It really stands out when we compare the Viltrox to the Kippertie. So as you can see, it doesn't really matter if the adapter is able to mount to the camera cage via a lens support, because the support foot is just one key ingredient to a two-part successful system. Without that positive locking mechanism, you are still going to get lens wiggle when racking focus, even with low torque settings on the motor. So that right there is a deal breaker for me personally. Sorry, Viltrox. But you know, Andrew Locke from Gaffer and Gear had a really good point. We need to keep the price of all of these tools in perspective. And when we compare the price tags of all three of these adapters, well, that puts the Viltrox in a completely different category. However, it is still important for me to compare all of these tools because I am out there working every day. And the whole reason for this vlog since day one has been sharing my experiences with all of you as I am treading through the trenches as a freelancer with an LLC in our filmmaking community right here in LA. Now, for all of my friends out there who love their autofocus, I did notice some weird things happening when the Viltrox was connected to the Red Komodo. But we do need to keep in mind that the Komodo's autofocus is still in beta mode, even after well over a year, but yes, it's still in beta mode, so keep that in mind even as we're talking about these things. However, that did not stop the Kippertie from performing very well with that beta autofocus. So in this side-by-side here, you'll see that the Kippertie is snapping back and forth pretty nicely, while the Viltrox is not responding at all. Even when I tried to tap to focus on the Komodo screen, that even was only working 50% of the time. Now, the other weird quirk is that there was some really wild stuff happening with the electronic aperture. It kept jumping around, and at one point it froze and got stuck with only providing me with two options. Okay, so now we're on the Viltrox. This is the Sigma ripped there. Yeah, there's a weird thing going on with the autofocus. So I could either shoot wide open at f1.2 or at the very deepest f-stop, so deep that it doesn't even actually exist on the Sigma Art, a whopping f159. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that this Viltrox focal reducer was not made specifically for the Red Komodo, so maybe all of my Canon C70 owners out there will have better luck. Now, speaking to that, the Red Komodo sensor is a tad larger than most Super 35 sensors. So you are going to see some vignetting when using the Viltrox with the Komodo if you're shooting in full frame 17:9, like that, you know, utilizing the full 6K sensor. You will vignette when using the Viltrox focal reducer pretty much with any lens that is underneath 28mm. Here you can see the full frame 25mm Milvus vignetting in the corners, and it gets much worse with the Milvus 18mm. Something else to keep in mind is that if you only own APS-C lenses, this Viltrox focal reducer is not going to work with anything under 35mm. So for instance, this Sigma Art 18-35 is an APS-C lens, and you can see how crazy it gets when using the Viltrox. And then it gets even crazier when using this bad boy, the old school Thrasher, I call it, the 11-20 f2.8 Tokina, yeah. So your best bet is just to stick with full frame glass. So, what is the final dog times verdict? Is that corny to say that? Who the f cares? So what is the final verdict on this Viltrox mount adapter EF-R3 0.71 times focal reducer? Look, the thing is, the fact that this is only $268 warrants it enough to keep it in the camera case for specific jobs. I'm thinking primarily of a pilot that I just shot this past summer where we did a lot of scenes at 120 frames per second. So as you all already know, I'm sure, the Komodo punches in on the sensor when you drop down to 2K from 6K. So in those circumstances, having something like this Viltrox could really come in clutch, because not only would it help with the crop factor, but also help with all the light loss that you get when you jump from 24 frames per second to 120. But other than that, I cannot think of any other scenario where I would want this on my camera. I'm sorry, but you guys know I keep it real. What it ultimately comes down to is what is more important to you as a creator and how are you creating? For instance, if you are a one-man band and pulling focus with your own hand, well, perhaps this Viltrox focal reducer could really be nice for you. But if you're working with a team and you have a first AC with a proper follow focus system, well, then I think you're going to run into some issues. But what the hell do I know? Maybe you don't care about the frame jumping up and down every time you rack focus. I don't know what anybody likes, and that is the pure beauty of this little thing we all call art. Everyone is allowed to do whatever the hell you want to do. There are no rules here, you little freaks. But if you want to see how I break the rules on a daily basis, you should be checking out the Dog Times Patreon. It is definitely the #1 way to support the show. I mean, I take everyone there on a virtual behind the scenes journey. I'm talking from the very beginning, from the ground up. You know, we start with the job pitch, sometimes the location scout, all of the previs, the pre-production. Then we go on the job. You know, I take you with me, via, camera, obviously, but, we go on set and you're there for the whole journey. And literally every day I spend on set, we break down on the Patreon. It's a cool interactive way to support the channel and what I do here. All right, folks, that's gonna do it. Thank you for watching. Shout out to all my awesome loyal supporters over on the Patreon. And for now, that is a wrap. All right. Hear how loud that plane is? Can you hear that plane? The plane, the plane, the plane, the plane. That's just, I don't even know what just happened. I blacked out for like 2 seconds. It's so fucking loud, man. I feel like we have to move to the country, man. Moving to the country, gonna eat a lot of peaches. Moving to the country, gonna eat a lot of peaches.